All right. I think it looks like most of the people in the waiting room are in. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Abby Edwards, and I use she and her pronouns. And I'm the Adaptation Planning Grant Program Manager on the Integrated Climate Adaptation and Resiliency Program team. I'm joined by my teammates Brandon and Sarah and Mariah and Allie. And we're also joined by the ICARP Climate Services team, Ben and Nikki. Sarah is on tech support today, so let her know if you have any questions or challenges. So we want to begin this meeting by acknowledging the state of California exists on occupied territory of over 110 federally recognized tribes and over 70 non-federally recognized tribes. This land has been stewarded by Indigenous people since time immemorial. And we acknowledge the critical importance of these lands and waters to Indigenous people of California today. And we at the Office of Planning and Research join you all from Sacramento, California on ancestral territory of the Southern Maidu, Valley Miwok, Patwin, and Nisenan people. So if you're all up for it, could you share your name, your organization, and where you're calling in from in the chat? That would be great. So we recognize, the commitment that it takes to attend these sessions. So we really appreciate everyone joining us today, and we're really excited for the conversation. So I'll give you sort of an overview of what this workshop will look like. So this is part 2 of our 3-part series. So we have a really exciting agenda. So we're going to start by talking through the elements of the Adaptation Planning Grant Program. We'll go over a high-level overview, walk through the timeline, application components, and next steps. And then we're going to spend the bulk of the time with the Climate Services team. So we'll hand it over to Nikki and Ben, who will go over some of the climate adaptation and resilience tools and resources that we've outlined in the program guidelines. They'll go over SB 379 requirements, walk through the phases of the Adaptation Planning Guide, and also talk through some of the climate services tools. And for today, for the application overview, we're just going to keep it pretty high level. So we'll share a link right now in the chat to the full application overview workshop that we had in January that goes into more detail. So we won't go into that level of detail today. And we don't anticipate this presentation taking up the whole time, so we'll save some time at the end for Q&A. So here's a quick look at our program timeline. As some may remember, we kicked off engagement last March, and we developed the draft program guidelines. We had public comment period and refined the program. And in the chat, we'll share the overview of the engagement from last year, and how we responded to program feedback. And you'll see that all outlined in the program, the public comment period summary. And then we launched the intent survey in November, and we'll go over sort of what that is in a minute if you don't know, and release the full application materials in January. So right now we're about halfway through the application window, and it closes on March 31st at 5 p.m. And we expect to go into the full awards in early summer. So quickly, before we really jump into the bulk of this session, what is the program all about? So the Adaptation Planning Grant Program leverages $25 million to fund local, regional, and tribal communities in integrated climate adaptation planning. By facilitating climate adaptation planning, APGP supports the development of climate resilient projects across the state. So this round, we have 6.6 million available for the first round, and then we'll have subsequent rounds of funding in the coming years. And the award amounts range from 150,000 to 650,000. So throughout our 2022 engagement, we identified and refined the priorities of the program. So the first priority is to explicitly and meaningfully prioritize equitable outcomes, and particularly in the most vulnerable communities. And that's by establishing an inclusive funding program that removes barriers for applicants and ensures that awardees represent a wide geographic, economic, and population diversity. The second is to encourage communities to equitably plan for and respond to multiple climate risks. And that's by centering the needs of vulnerable communities and supporting an all-risk approach to adaptation planning. And these grants really encourage communities to conduct integrated planning activities. And then the third one is to support integrated social and physical infrastructure planning to achieve community resilience. So the program will provide flexible funding to meet multi-sector and issue planning needs that intersect with climate risks. So it's including but not limited to land use, transportation, economic, housing, natural resource management, public infrastructure, and hazard mitigation issues. The fourth one is to build a statewide capacity to plan for and implement equitable planning strategies. That's by supporting peer-to-peer learning, communities of practice, information sharing, and publishing case studies on the state adaptation clearinghouse. And then the last one is to really embed equity into the planning process. And that's from project visioning all the way through to project evaluation. That's by increasing opportunities for shared decision-making, utilizing inclusive processes, and actively remediating historic underinvestment by fairly distributing access to the benefits and privileges associated with the community investment. So those are some of the priorities that we refined through our engagement over the past year. So getting into eligibility, local public entities, California Native American tribes, community-based organizations, 501c3 nonprofits are all eligible to apply. And there should be a minimum of one co-applicant in addition to the lead applicant. And more than one co-applicant is encouraged. And either one of those should be a public entity or a tribe. And then community-based organizations should partner with a local public entity or tribe as listed to ensure that the planning efforts funded can ultimately be implemented by local, regional, or tribal entities. Similarly, public entities should partner with community-based organizations to ensure that the planning efforts are centering the needs of vulnerable communities. We have this all really outlined in detail in the guidelines, so please reference those as you're considering. And in all of these cases, we really understand that one size fits all doesn't always work. And in these cases, we will accept a justification as to why partnership with a public entity or community-based organization is not feasible. And again, please reference the guidelines for more details there. So Mariah is adding some links in the chat for some of these materials. And then for some of you who might be watching this recording back, all of these resources that we were referencing can be found on our website, which you can find by typing ICARP Adaptation Planning Grants in your browser. So applicants complete the request for full application intent survey from November 7th, and we're receiving it ongoing until the 31st. But we are encouraging folks to submit them as soon as possible. And one note here on the intent survey, we've gotten this question a few times, so it's worth noting here. The surveys are not going to be evaluated as a part of your full application package. It's really just a touch point with us, an opportunity to get access to your individualized SharePoint folder to submit your application and sort of have a touch point with us. And Brandon will share a little bit more detail on that as well. And then as noted, we released the NOFA on the 6th. And then again, as noted, application materials are due before 5 p.m. on March 31st. So I'm going to hand it over to Brandon, who will give a really high level overview of the application components. Brandon?
Great, thanks, Abby. Thanks everyone for being here. So as Abby had mentioned, after completing the Adaptation Planning Grant Intent Survey, applicants will have access to an individual SharePoint folder. And this folder contains all of the application materials that you'll need, the full application, and the materials folder will also include specific documents. I'm going to give a high-level overview of those just for your edification and so you know what to expect. The general narrative questions doc, which you see here, is a Word doc template that can be found in the folder, and it gives you a some instructions at the beginning of the document that include correct formatting and naming conventions. Each team will be responsible for completing one general narrative questions doc for the overall proposal, and we strongly encourage each project team to answer those questions completely. There are 5 sections with a total of 6 questions, and each section includes a word count that should be adhered to as strict as possible. For those who might be curious, yes, images such as graphics and maps are allowed to be pasted into this document. The blue headers at the top of each section are going to coincide with the scoring criteria from the grant guidelines. So when you're answering each question, please be sure to review the appropriate scoring criteria in the guidelines to gain more information and improve your score. In some instances, the scoring criteria section of the guidelines will contain links to additional resources that will help you better answer that question. Again, additional formatting instructions can be found at the top of that document. Next slide, please. So the application workbook is also going to be a document that you can find in the full application folder, SharePoint folder. In the workbook itself, there will be 3 main tabs that must be completed by the applicants. And those tabs are an application summary, a work plan, and a budget. There are additional tabs which include examples and references to help guide applicants through the process. These examples are purely demonstrative and not actual work plans or budgets, so please do not copy those. They are merely examples. Applicant work plans should have clear timelines and discrete tasks with detailed deliverables. And the budget line items should clearly align with those tasks described in the work plan. If applicants experience any difficulty whatsoever with the workbook formatting or formulas or functionality, please feel free to contact myself, Brandon. Next slide, please. So to summarize the full application process, we have step 1, which is to complete the request for full application intent survey. As mentioned, APGP staff, most likely myself, will provide a direct link to an individual SharePoint folder where you'll be able to access the full application materials. And you will see my name in the invitation. It will look like an email directly from me, Brandon Harrell. Full applications, which will include general narrative questions, workbook, and a folder where you'll be able to submit your letters of support, are all due by 5 p.m. on Friday, March 31st of this year. And you'll just add them to your own SharePoint folder. There's instructions in the folder as well, in case you want to go back and check those out. Applicants will not be able to access their folder after 5 p.m. on March 31st. It's a full stop, so even 1 minute late is considered late. So make sure you have that in by then. Next slide, please. Applications, will be reviewed and evaluated by the Adaptation Planning Grant staff and our interagency review panel, which includes 11 state agencies. Following the initial application review, members of the review panel will conduct interviews with top scoring applicants. Adaptation Planning Grant Program anticipates making awards on June 1st of 2023. So with that, I'll hand it back to Abby, who will walk you through the next steps.
Thanks, Brandon. All right, so before we hand it over to Nikki and Ben, we wanted to share what we'll be up to over the next few weeks. So we're reviewing intent surveys as they come through, sending any clarifying questions or emails in response to the surveys. We're hosting office hours Wednesdays from 1 to 2. And for office hours, it's first come, first serve, and each person is allocated 10 minutes with us, unless there's no one in the waiting room. And if we aren't able to get to everyone, we'll schedule follow-up calls with those that waited, although we've been able to get to everyone through our office hours. And we're adding the registration in the chat. And then we also have part 3 of our application workshop, where we're partnering with the Office of Emergency Services And we'll talk through some of our priority funding areas and talk through different federal funding opportunities. I think it's going to be a pretty fun and interactive workshop. So I encourage folks to register. I think we're going to add the link in the chat as well. And then we're also updating our FAQ weekly. So that's through questions and answers that come through our inbox, questions that come through office hours. We update that FAQ weekly, and we want to make sure that everyone has access to the same information. So we also are sharing that link in the chat. And then finally, if you want us to come speak about this program, this opportunity, feel free to reach out to us and we'd be happy to schedule something. So with that, I think I'm going to hand it over to Nikki.
Good afternoon, everyone. Hi, Nikki Caravelli here. I am an associate planner with our Climate Services Program, which is another climate program under the Integrated Climate Adaptation and Resiliency Program at the Governor's Office of Planning and Research. My primary role within this team is to manage the state's Adaptation Clearinghouse, which if you haven't checked it out at resilientca.org, you definitely should. There's a lot of fun resources on there. So today, next slide, please. I'm going to start off by talking about some of the adaptation planning requirements for local governments, as well as some of the templates and checklists from the Adaptation Planning Guide that are available to you should you want to use them. And then I'll pass it over to Ben McMahon, the Climate Services Program Manager, to talk about some of the climate change tools that are available. Next slide. So if you're not familiar with the general plan, there are many required components to the general plan. There's specific elements that a city or county must address and develop in their general plan, which is essentially the long-range plan for their community. It identifies land uses and priorities for the next 20, 30, 40 years, usually defined by the community themselves. And this general plan is important to be aware of if you're planning on working with a local government, so that you can understand the climate adaptation requirements that the city or county might be facing, understand how you might be able to collaborate with them, what they can and can't address during this process. So really encourage you to kind of look more into this if you're working with a city or county, or if you're a city or county, you should also probably understand the climate impact and adaptation requirements if you don't already. So next slide, one of the topical requirements that must be addressed in the general plan is climate adaptation. And this is specifically found in statute in the Government Code 65302G4, which requires that climate adaptation and resilience are incorporated into the general plan safety element, either directly or by incorporating another plan by reference. And this is triggered upon the next update to a city's hazard mitigation plan or county hazard mitigation plan, or if there's no hazard mitigation plan, then it's triggered upon January 1st, 2022, which already happened. So the next relevant piece of statute is basically requiring that after that initial update to the safety element, that cities and counties need to update that information no less frequently than every 8 years upon the next update to their housing element or hazard mitigation plan, either whatever happens first, but no less frequently than every 8 years. Next slide, please. So some of the requirements of this statute is that the safety element needs to be reviewed and updated in order to address climate adaptation and resiliency. The safety element can also be reviewed and updated and then can reference another planning document, such as the hazard mitigation plan or an adaptation plan or another document, as long as those plans address the necessary requirements in the statute. And some of these other requirements include completing a vulnerability assessment, developing adaptation goals, policies, and objectives, and developing feasible implementation measures. An additional detail and guidance on this is in our general plan guidelines, chapter 4. And you should also look at the specific statutory language for the legal parameters on, the specific details. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to get super into detail here, but there is specific types of information that are required to be reviewed as part of this process, such as looking at the CalAdapt climate projections tool, reviewing the adaptation planning guide. Next slide, please. Looking at local hazard data, looking at planned development, looking at local agencies. Next slide. And we can come back to this if folks have specific questions on this information, happy to go into these slides in more detail. There's also specific requirements for the implementation measures, such as, what types of measures you should be considering for land use or for natural infrastructure and for collaborative work with other agencies. And one final note I want to make on general plans is that our office, the Office of Planning Research, does not regulate the general plan. We just provide guidance and support. So we cannot tell you if you're compliant or if you're legally following the right track or whatever. We can't provide legal advice, but we can provide you resources and support and guidance. Next slide. So the last kind of piece I want to touch on in terms of requirements is that cities and counties are required to address environmental justice in their general plans if they're updating 2 or more elements at the same time, and if the jurisdiction has a disadvantaged community. And how that is defined is within the specific statute. The important thing to note here is that local governments and those who are partnering with local governments have the opportunity to address both climate adaptation and environmental justice priorities at the same time, or to have those efforts inform each other, as well as address these state requirements at the same time. So one example of what that might look like is that many of the same populations that are residing in environmental justice areas are likely to be considered vulnerable to hazards and the impacts of climate change. So having this analysis and these planning activities inform each other can make the process more effective, potentially improve the quality of the process and the outcomes. And there's more information on all of this in the general plan guidelines, specifically the environmental justice chapter, which I think Mariah will be sharing in the chat. Next slide. So just to kind of follow up on that note of kind of alignment between different planning requirements, there are a lot of considerations when you're planning for climate change, a lot of different requirements when you're looking at wildfire or sea level rise or adaptation. And there's a lot of different plans out there, hazard mitigation plans, general plans, coastal program plans. It can be a bit confusing to navigate all of them and understand how they fit together and how they can align and complement each other. So we have this climate resilience plan alignment toolkit, which is available in the Adaptation Clearinghouse to help folks navigate that process. Next slide. So now I want to dive into some of the templates that are available on the state's Adaptation Planning Guide. And this is all available on the Adaptation Clearinghouse at the link you see on the screen, www.resilientca.org/APG. So within the Adaptation Planning Guide, there's 4 phases, right? And this is referenced in the grant program guidelines. Specifically in phase 1 and phase 2, there are a couple of curated templates that support the guidance. And a lot of folks may not know about these templates and checklists, but this could be a really great way to get started and save you some time if you're trying to get organized. So I'm going to kind of walk through what's available so you can see. Next slide. Within phase 1, there is a template for helping you define your community vision and goals, whether you're a local government or you're someone who's partnering with a local government or developing your own plan. You might find this worksheet helpful. Next slide. There's also an example timeline and work plan linked there. And in this timeline and work plan, there is a list of typical timeframes that it takes to develop a vulnerability assessment, or, address specific pieces of the adaptation planning process, depending on where you are in the process. So that will be really helpful for understanding how much time your different tasks might take. Next slide. There's also a network mapping template, or a stakeholder mapping template, some might call it. This can be helpful when you're trying to figure out who to engage and to make sure that you're, covering all your bases, getting everyone involved. Next slide. So in phase 2, there are a number of resources to both continue the community engagement process, as well as for developing vulnerability assessments. One example up on the screen is a stakeholder interview tracking template with example questions that you can ask to help get a community response on what climate impacts you might address, as well as what past hazards you should be looking at, and adaptive capacity. Next slide. There's an example interview questionnaire that can be used as supporting resource for that interview tracking template. Next slide. There is also a vulnerability assessment checklist. There's a lot of steps if you're following the adaptation planning guide process. I don't think folks are required to follow the process in the guide, but it may be very helpful. If you are, there are a lot of steps involved, and so this checklist might be helpful for you. Next slide. This sample adaptive capacity matrix is a good way to break down the information and understand what adaptive capacity is and keep track of it. Next slide. And then finally, we have an Excel spreadsheet that can be used for summarizing and scoring vulnerability once you've gone through the research and analysis process. And this will actually help you understand and assign values in terms of who or what is most vulnerable and why. Next slide. With that, I'm going to pass it over to Ben.
Thanks, Nikki. Yeah, so today I wanted to spend just a little bit of time going over some of the climate tools and resources that are available, just thinking through kind of the steps you might be in the process, and just giving kind of a high-level overview of some of the climate change tools, resources, and the toolkits and things that you might use in terms of identifying places you might work, the climate risks you might be grappling with, or how you might be using that to inform adaptation planning down the line. So first, I wanted to talk through some of the tools that are really designed to identify climate change risks and exposure, specifically some of the climate change risk profile tools that are out there on CalAdapt in terms of and also mapping, and then taking a step forward and identifying some of the tools that help identify or map hazards and define some of the exposure to those climate change risks. So next slide, please. Okay, so on CalAdapt, there's quite a number of resources that you could dive into. And so I've just picked a couple that I wanted to focus on. First is the Climate Profiles tool, which is also called the Local Climate Snapshot. So this really lets you think about what are some of the present and future climate conditions at a particular location of interest. So you can identify a region, you can check some of the timelines, and you can consider some of the different variables such as temperature, precipitation, or wildfire, and think about what the climate risk looks like based on historical observations, as well as some of the various models that project out that climate change signal into the far future. So you can think about what some of that risk might look like. The other thing that tool will let you do is some of the projection maps, which take a look at some of the larger scale patterns of a changing climate. So in this case, we're looking at a map of projected temperature change, and we're looking at the change from a historical baseline, which can be useful when looking at relative climate conditions as opposed to some of the absolute values, which is also a tool that's available. So you can think about precipitation, some of the temperature profiles, and just thinking about how you might use either, the long-term, time mapping of what these climate change signals look like with the profile, or the spatial distribution of some of these climate hazards, looking at some of these mapping tools. Next slide. And before I go to the next slide, I will say there's a number of other tools on CalAdapt that you could explore that you might use. These are just two that I wanted to highlight that are kind of a good starting point in terms of thinking about the long-term climate risk as well as the spatial distribution of those risks. Next slide, please. Another thing you might want to consider is thinking about how you might map these hazards and highlight really the exposure to some of those aspects. So on the left, we have Cal Enviroscreen, Screen, which is really helpful in terms of thinking about environmental exposure. And on the right, the CHVI tool, which is helpful. And there's others that do this as well, but think about how we might think about climate change related vulnerability and health related vulnerability. And so in both cases, we have scores or ranks of relative exposure to environmental hazards or climate extremes. And so these both really kind of help think through, in addition to what the climate profile tool is just showing, which is kind of the baseline climate risks. This is allowing us to think about maps to the exposure to those hazards. And some of these tools also have some additional guidance on how we might think about the types of sort of downstream conditions that might be further affected by these type of climate risks. So, in the example on the right, it's the projected number of extreme heat days in the far future. And so then there's some additional guidance on how that might be informed by some of those climate risks. Next slide, please. So an example of this, of how we might use a couple of those tools, is to think about extreme heat risks. So the local climate snapshot tool is really helpful to identify those warming trends, to think through, okay, what are the historical conditions look like, and what might the present, the near present, the intermediate future, and the long-term future look like in terms of possible climate change signals. But then the hazard mapping tools can also help you take a deeper, kind of a deeper dive to identify some of those areas of concern for elevated heat risk. So it's an opportunity to look at both the long-term trend that we're concerned about in terms of a changing climate, but also some of the specific hazards and exposures that we might see at a smaller scale. And so some of the tools will allow you to drill down and really look at, as far as like census tracts or county level or regional scale, to think through, what do these climate change hazards look like, and what does exposure look like on both an absolute and a relative basis, depending on which tool you're using. Next slide, please. Okay, so another goal that we might see, or another aspect in the grant guides, is how we might describe climate change risks and the exposures on a community. So how to impacts a community, and particularly in vulnerable populations. And so in order to do this, we have to better consider how we might define vulnerability, what some of the demographic characteristics we might be looking for are, and then how does this connect to climate change or climate risk scenarios. Next slide, please. So first of all, we might think about mapping some of the baseline demographic characteristics, kind of a first pass at defining vulnerability. And there's a number of tools out there that can help you do this. A few examples that I've highlighted here are the CDC Social Vulnerability Index, which gives a baseline consideration of community scale or even census tract scale, social vulnerability on a relative basis. We have the Disadvantaged Communities Mapping tool, which again identifies regions based on their disadvantaged community status, and then the Regional Opportunity Index, which is another way of characterizing kind of the variable impact of what the social characteristics are in a community. And all of these really help us think through what are the baseline characteristics of a community, what are some of the demographic characteristics of those communities that might contribute to ongoing vulnerability, and then how might we look at some of the spatial characteristics of those communities and really zoom in and identify, is this a community of interest, and what are some of the different characteristics attached to that we might use. Next slide, please. And so one step beyond that in terms of using some of those demographic characteristics, or we start to look at the combinations of the social characteristics as well as the climate data. And there's a number of tools that offer opportunities to do this, and I've highlighted a few examples here. One is the Climate and Economic Justice Screening Tool, which has some baseline socioeconomic information, but also has information about climate change, energy vulnerability, health vulnerability, housing, and a number of other social characteristics. And it allows you to look at the census level, what are some of the intersections of these social and climate-related vulnerabilities. Both of these other tools, use indicators as sort of a set of thresholds to identify risk areas based on a number of different scenarios that range from health-related, policy-related, and a number of other like demographic and social characteristics. But again, the idea here is that these tools help us look at what's the baseline social characteristics, and then what are some of the climate data bits of information that we might use in order to better understand how we would define vulnerability in those communities and identify areas that are priority areas to work on, or what some of the paths forward in terms of adaptation planning and what that might look like and why that's a priority area. Next slide, please. So one example would be how we might define and map climate vulnerability. Just pulled this one out of the air in terms of thinking about drought and water supply vulnerability. You might use a demographic profile tool to identify those priority areas for that vulnerability assessment. So using one of those demographic related tools, or maybe one of these scenario-based tools to think through, what are those relevant social and demographic characteristics? How do they intersect? And how does that amplify the climate risks and help us better understand why this is a priority area for some of these project activities? And so again, I think it's really helpful to think about that social baseline and then how some of these other tools can help us better understand that intersection between the social characteristics and the climate risks and vulnerabilities that are embedded in some of these regions and geographies. Next slide, please. Okay, so finally, I wanted to talk through just a couple quick examples of some of the resources that will help identify and prioritize climate adaptation measures, and to think through how that might address some of the anticipated climate impacts. And so I've got a couple examples of toolkits and planning guides that might help think about this going forward. A few other resources that we can turn to in terms of really diving in and thinking about how we define vulnerability and resilience and how that might inform the development of your work going forward. And then a few other examples of places to look for more adaptation resources if you have more questions. Okay, so next slide, please. Okay, so from the toolkits and planning guides perspective, these are really helpful in thinking through in terms of a process. They identify, there's an established process in place that helps you think through, and Nikki's example of the adaptation planning guide is a good example of this, where you think through where in the process is the work that you're going to be doing, and how does that inform the kind of work that you might do to prepare? So is this explore, define, and initiate the project? There could be assessing the vulnerability. This could be defining some of the adaptation work, or it could be how you might go into implementation and monitoring. And a few of these other toolkit examples are good examples of some of these toolkits in practice. Either to identify, the health-related process for that climate and health adaptation toolkit, or for these climate change and health profile reports, which identify on a county by county basis some of those key climate risks, the priorities for adaptation and intervention, and how that might inform some of the action going forward. And so again, all of these are different kinds of resources you can use to better understand where in the process a project might be, how it might interface with some of the needs of a community, and how that might help promote adaptation going forward based on using some of these different frameworks. Next slide, please. So in terms of diving into thinking about vulnerability and resilience, there's a couple of excellent resources that one might look to in terms of thinking about vulnerability on the left, which is the guide to defining vulnerable communities in the context of climate change. And on the right, the APN's report on mapping resilience, a blueprint for thriving in the face of climate disasters. Both of these really help think about how you as the local user, or you as the local expert might have knowledge of climate risk and context. And so you can think about how we define vulnerability and how that relates to your community where you might be working, and how that might better inform the process that you're engaging in. And then also this idea of how we think about resilience, and how that more in-depth conversation about how we might map and promote resilience might inform some of the work that you plan to do in the communities that you're engaging with. Next slide, please. So in terms of a larger kind of place where you might look to find some of these adaptation resources, we've already talked about the Adaptation Clearinghouse a few times, but I wanted to point to just a couple places that you might look. On the left, highlights some of the sector-specific topic pages that have a lot of different climate change information. So if you're looking for kind of examples of adaptation in practice or project work that's been done before, or some of the guides and resources that are available, there's a number of topical resources you can turn to that might help, give you some examples of some previous work that's been done, maybe a spark of innovation to think through what you want to do in terms of the project you're thinking about proposing, and also to find some of the resources that connect to some of these different topical areas. And on the right, I'm highlighting some of the case studies, which are really, this adaptation in practice, which can really highlight what does some of this work look like on the ground. And so I think, again, you can turn to these as case study examples of some of the plans and projects across the state to see examples of the ways some of these resources have been used and the ways they've been used to promote and develop adaptation and adaptation resources. Next slide, please. Another place you could look to in terms of examples of some of the work that's being done is the Resilient CA Adaptation Planning Map, or the RAP map. The URL there lists, but points to some of the various types of adaptation planning that's underway across the state. And so you can see examples of hazard mitigation plans, the general plans that Nikki talked about, also examples of vulnerability assessments and other adaptation plans in place. So really just another opportunity to see what does some of these activities look like in practice, to give examples of what this could look like, or to maybe spark some imagination on what some of the new projects that you might be thinking about going forward could look like. Next slide, please. And just to point to the Adaptation Clearinghouse one more time, there's also a find a tool feature. So if there's something in particular that you're thinking about, not on one of the pages that we presented today, but you can kind of take your own deep dive and poke around and see what other things might be there. And I'd encourage you to do that on either the Clearinghouse or on the CalAdapt page. And then also from the guidance from the grants, any other local or regional vulnerability assessment or plan is also something that could be considered. Yeah, I think I'd just point back to the Adaptation Clearinghouse as someplace you might turn to if you're looking for what some of these examples look like, or if you have an idea of something you're looking for, to use that search tool to dive in and see if there's something that kind of helps serve as an example or, for the type of work that you're considering. Next slide, please. With that, just thank you. We wanted to kind of give a quick high-level overview and leave plenty of time for Q&A. Also, we've provided our emails here. If anybody has any questions, would like to reach out about some of these, happy to answer those emails or to have a conversation about that.
Great. Thank you so much to Ben and Nikki for that overview. I know it was a lot of information. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. And I wanted to open it up just in case. I think that I might be a little bit behind on the chat because I was sharing my screen, so I can look in the chat to see if there are any questions. But if people wanted to raise their hand, go off mute, and ask Ben and Nikki any questions, please feel free to. Yeah, Mo, I see your hand first, and then Amber after that.
Thank you. I'll turn my camera on, but I apologize that I look like this today. Hi, everybody. So there was a little bit of confusion on the eligibility. I think my team noticed that in the frequently asked questions, CSUs are not allowed, but then in the guidelines, they are allowed. And then when I did the initial survey, I clearly said I'm at CSU and you allowed. So I'm confused. I've been working really hard with my team, but we wanted to just hear from you. Yes, no?
Yeah, thanks, Mo, for this question. So